Rahman, Abdullah, the son of Umar, the son of Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him. He said, I heard the Prophet of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, saying that Islam is founded upon 5 things, 5 pillars. Testifying that there is no God except for Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger, and the establishment of prayer, and giving in charity, and pilgrimage to the house, the Kaaba, and fasting in Ramadan. And these are the 5 pillars that we are familiar with. This was narrated by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. The first question I think that comes to mind when you read this hadith is that the last 2 weeks we were going over Hadith Jibreel. Hadith Jibreel encompasses the first question that Jibreel asks is أخبرني عن الإسلام, right? Tell me about Islam. And Muhammad ﷺ says these exact 5 things. And so your question is, why does Imam Nawawi bring forth a hadith that goes over exactly what we just went over in the hadith before? Like, it seems like there's some redundancy there. And so there's some reflections on that, the first of which, most obvious, is that it's very much emphasizing the importance of these 5 pillars. And more than just that, it's showing how fundamental these 5 pillars are to everything. And I think throughout this lecture, you'll kind of get a feel of why that is. One beautiful reflection that we'll go over at the very end is that these kind of 5 pillars are the established, like they kind of established the foundation for everything. All other good deeds kind of trickle out once you get these 5 major basic things down. And inshallah we'll go over it in more detail. The narrator is Abdullah bin Umar bin Khattab, so the son of Umar bin Khattab, who narrated the first 2 hadiths. So this is his son, and you could do a whole lecture just on Abdullah's life. But the context of why he mentioned this hadith, so why did Abdullah narrate this hadith, is that later on in his life, so Abdullah grew up, he was a youth during Muhammad's life. He was too young to go to Uhud. His first battle was Khandaq, so it kind of shows you his age range. And so he was young during the Prophet's life, and so he lived until like a much later time after the Prophet. And when he was older, later on in his life, a man came up to him and asked, like, why don't you go for jihad? Isn't that like a fundamental pillar of our faith? And so he responded with this hadith that these are the 5 fundamental pillars of our faith, as narrated to us by the Prophet. But then the question is, there's so many other aspects to our faith. Like the man mentioned, jihad is one of them. Maybe why isn't Quran mentioned here, right? Why isn't modesty mentioned here? Why isn't truth, justice, all these other fundamental aspects of our faith? There's a lot of other things you can imagine being encompassed as foundational to Islam. But why these 5? So there's a lot of wisdom and stuff that we derive from reflecting on them, but there isn't like a hadith or Quran ayah that'll tell you like this is why these 5 were picked. But again, like these are kind of the minimum, and that's minimum doesn't mean that you're like belittling the actions. It's showing you how important they are in the eyes of Allah. And so when you go over why 5, why not 4, why not 3, why not 7, there's a few things that kind of that are kind of beautiful that I've heard reflected on this. The first is that there's this kind of diagram that I drew, a very poor diagram over here. We'll walk through it inshallah. But if you imagine kind of actions, worship, kind of as this like bubble, right, like a big bubble. Within that, there's 2 different sets, right? There's things that are kind of internal, things that you don't necessarily show to other people, like no one has to know about you. And there's things that are kind of external. So the internal immediately is shahada. That's your belief inside your heart in Allah. And like in this, it's kind of like the outward testament, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu Muhammadur Rasulullah. That's saying that's something that's rooted inside of you, in your heart. And then there's things that you do externally with like your limbs. Now the external is kind of divided into 2 sub-branches, things that you're told to do and things you're told to not do. And so to master the things, to like avoid things, because when you speak of something that's an action, there's actions where you do the action and there's actions where you avoid a certain action. And so Psalm teaches us how to avoid certain actions, and that's kind of that aspect. And then when you do something, doing something with your body, that's salah. Doing something with your resources, your wealth, that is zakat. And the combination of body and resources is Hajj. And that's kind of a cool framework to show you how everything basically is encompassed within that kind of framework. And everything else you do is somehow you're training for it through these 5 pillars. And then there's another diagram, which also is very similar, but it breaks it down in just a slightly different way. Shahada is something that you do with your tongue. And then there's actions that you do with your limb. Again, there's things that you do that you actually do, and that's salah. And there's things that you avoid and you train yourself to stay away from, and you train that through fasting. And then there's also wealth, like you controlling your wealth, and that is zakat, training you to give freely to other people through zakat. And the combination of all these, kind of summarizing them, is Hajj. In Hajj, you're doing labaiks and reciting Quran. You're doing tawaf and sa'i, so that's an action. You're staying away from things while you're in ihram. There's certain things you're not supposed to do. It takes money and resources to get there and to get through Hajj. So Hajj is kind of the culmination of that. And if you imagine every action you're going to do is going to fall into one of these categories of like actions you're trying to avoid, like sins, things you're trying to do physically or with your tongue or with your wealth. Every good deed's kind of encompassed in that. So it's these kind of 5 pillars are training grounds almost for everything else beyond them. And there's also this concept of, in Islam about, well, first of all, we know farad, right? So farad, we oftentimes translate it as like obligation, obligatory. Kind of gives a wrong impression, I think, with that translation. Maybe something like prescription. It's hard to define it exactly. It's not obligatory because no one's like holding a gun to your head saying you have to pray, right? Like it's something that we're choosing to do. But it's this prescription that's prescribed upon all of us. Farad is something that if you do it, there's a reward for it, and if you avoid it, there's a sin. As opposed to something we might call sunnah or nafil or mustahab. Those are things where if you do it, there's a reward, and if you avoid it, there's no sin. So farad is something, if you avoid it, there's a sin. But there's also 2 different kinds of farad. There's farad, what we call farad ayn, and farad kifaya. Farad ayn is a farad that it's an individual responsibility where every person must do it, is responsible for that action. Farad kifaya is a community obligation, where as long as that action is fulfilled by somebody in the community, then it's fine. Not every single person must do it. So an example might be the Friday prayer. All men who are of age and sound mind and healthy must attend Friday prayer. So if you're an individual in that category, it's your individual responsibility to attend. Whereas, for example, being a scholar, that's a community obligation. Not every single person in the community must become a scholar. So you need some sort of scholarship in the community to preserve the faith, to judge between matters, to teach people the religion. And so those are kind of 2 distinctions. And so these are 5 examples of farad ayn where every person is responsible for them at some point in their life. Fasting in Ramadan, salah during the 5 times each day, shahada 24/7, zakat once a year, on extra wealth, and hajj one time in life. But these are all individual actions that every Muslim, not man or woman, nothing, every Muslim of age and sound mind must perform one of these actions. So that's also kind of why these 5 are mentioned, because everyone's encompassed within them. And there also another kind of reflection is, it's kind of more like a reflection for us to put in our mind, is that if you imagine a tent generally, like the basic structure of a tent, the most basic tent you can build, would have 4 pillars, and then a middle pillar that holds up the top. And even if you are missing one of the 4 pillars, you can still kind of have a tent or a lean-in or something like that. But without that middle pillar, which is in this case the shahada, the whole thing kind of falls on itself. It's not supported. So if you don't have that shahada and belief in God, the other actions don't matter. So that's why shahada is very important. So we'll start with that. What do we learn from shahada? The first thing is that it's a kind of negation affirmation statement. So the first thing you say is that there is no God. That's the first part of the shahada, la ilaha. And you say illallah, except for Allah. And so that's kind of the most simple and unambiguous statement that you can make. If you tell someone that you cannot do anything except read right now. It's not just if you ask someone, oh hey, can you read? It's oh, maybe I can read in 10 minutes, or maybe read a little bit, or maybe he doesn't really want me to read, just kind of recommendation. But if you say do not do anything except for reading, then that person knows that in that instant they must read. And that's kind of the same thing with shahada. It's not just oh, there is Allah. It's no, there's no God except for Allah. And that's a very clear, direct statement. There's no ambiguity there. And there's also the testifying that there's the messenger of Allah. And that's very, very important to our whole faith, because much of the legislation and lessons and understanding of the Quran and our religion and how to act all comes from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sunnah. And so it's fundamental to our religion that we believe that Muhammad ﷺ is the messenger of God, and that what he sent is legislative, and that we follow and obey him without any hesitation at all. And we must, this another part of the shahada is that we must not be afraid of proclaiming the shahada. regardless of the consequences. And in the lecture, Mufti Kamani was reflecting on the point that we're very, like, especially as American Muslims, we're very, it's very easy for us, especially actually as Berkeley Muslims maybe, it's very easy for us to go out and be like, yeah, we're for social justice and we're for this, we're for that. And we go under that motto, but because it's popular. And as soon as it becomes issues of addressing immoralities in society that are not social justice issues, we become silent all of a sudden. And so that's like a kind of dual personality, dual persona that we have out in public, because we're afraid of proclaiming, first of all, like our faith and like what the faith proclaims, and we should not be ashamed out of any of it. And there's many, many examples of this in the Prophet's life and the Sahaba. Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca and he started preaching the faith, at one point near the Kaaba, the people of Mecca gathered around and started like beating him up, and Abu Bakr came and sought them, and he took the beating himself, and he said, like, are you going to kill a man just because he's proclaiming that there's no God but Allah? And so Muhammad ﷺ wasn't doing it as like it's a popular move, and like you're not like posting Facebook likes to get like shares. It was a very unpopular move and went against all society standards. And he was getting beat up for it, and he's getting trashed for it, and he's getting ostracized for it, and everything. Got kicked out of the city for it, but you still proclaim it proudly. And it's something that we must also have a lot of value for, not just for the struggle of the Prophet ﷺ, but how much it means to Allah also. For us it might seem like, oh, it's just a word to be said, or something that you say you believe, but to Allah it means a lot. And there's a hadith that mentions a man who had 99 scrolls full of bad deeds, like 99 volumes, I'd say, not scrolls, 99 volumes of bad deeds, sins that are on his scales on the Day of Judgment. And each individual volume was further than the eye can see. And he has 99 of them on his scale. And on his good deed scale, he only has a piece of paper. So the man looks at this and he's like, there's no way, like I am so done. And he's terrified. But on that piece of paper, the only thing that's on it is his shahada, is his belief in God and the messenger, or a messenger, like before Muhammad ﷺ. And so that shahada itself in God outweighed all the volumes of sins. So for us, it might seem as like very like, oh, it's like whatever, but like it means a lot, and we should value that more, I think. We don't reflect on that enough. So that's the point of shahada. Next thing is iqam as-salah. So the establishment of prayer. So why prayer? So prayer is really the differentiating feature of Islam. Prophet said that like the thing that distinguishes us and non-Muslims is salah itself, the act of prayer. And it was so much so that the Sahaba, if they saw anyone who was doing anything, any kind of sin, or they were not doing any kind of good deeds, like if they weren't fasting Ramadan, they'd say, oh, maybe they're sick. Or if they saw them drinking, they'd be like, all right, maybe like he had an addiction problem. Or like they'd make any excuse for anybody, for any reason, no matter what they saw, except for when someone didn't pray. When someone did not pray, they'd be like, all right, this guy cannot be a Muslim. And that was the only thing that people would judge each other's faith on, because this is what our faith is founded on. And so the Prophet ﷺ, when he was passing away, his parting advice to everyone was, he said, as-salah, as-salah, as-salah. He repeated it 3 times, salah, reminding us the importance of prayer in our lives, and that was his parting advice to all Muslims. And when he received even the command for salah, every other command came to us, in every other prophet, in every other time, throughout all of human history, every command basically, except from Sayyidina Adam, every command after that has come through like angels or something to earth. Except salah, Muhammad ﷺ was brought up to the sky, brought up to Allah himself, closer than any creation has ever gone, and he gave them the command for salah. That's like the most special command given out of any human history ever. Like no other prophet did that. And so it's like it shows you how important it was to receive this message, and how important salah is itself, and how punctual Muhammad ﷺ was with his salah. So it kind of shows us the weight that salah had in our deen. And so, salah is part of this conversation. If someone asks like, how do I talk to Allah? Quran is Allah talking to you, and dua is you kind of talking to Allah and requesting from Allah. And so salah is this conversation. It's facilitated for us 5 times a day, directly with no intercessor, straight with Allah. And so it should be a priority in our day. Like the important point of salah is that it should be kind of the cornerstone in our day. Just like you plan your commutes, just like you plan your classes, just like you plan work, you should also be planning salah as like the fundamental things, rather than saying, oh, I'll pray salah like right before I go out to lunch. You should be like, no, I'm going to go out to lunch after I finish my salah. Like even if nothing changes in your day, just the mental switch of salah is the cornerstone and everything else is being around it, Like that's just an important distinction, even if the physical thing doesn't change, as long as that distinction is in our minds. And it's a time for us to express dependency on Allah. It's kind of a beautiful thing about salah is that no matter what state your heart's in, it's going to have a remedy for it to improve the state of your heart. If you're coming in from a state of arrogance or ego, or you feel like there's this kind of pride that you have and you need to beat it down, then going down into sujood is a form of you going, Allah commanding you to go down and bow in front of Him and showing you your humble place. And if you're coming from a place of like khushu' and like you have a lot of love in the moment for Allah, then sujood becomes a place of you getting closer to Allah and becoming, getting that attachment to Allah and showing your love and affection for Allah. So no matter what state your heart's in the moment, salah is always going to provide you with some sort of benefit. So much so that if you exit salah and there isn't some sort of change or benefit that you've gotten from that salah, then that's a huge opportunity that we've lost. And so each salah should have that kind of impact, that reminder, and change something about us. And the other thing is that we should also do it with excellence. So there's the fiqh of it, right? Just doing it properly, knowing, learning, researching the proper etiquette, the proper procedure of salah itself. That's like a point of excellence. The clothes, right? Coming properly clothed to the masjid, or even in prayer at home. There's actually an ayah, I think, about it. Arham, do you remember the ayah? Right, so like, oh, children of Adam, like take your adornments or take your like good garments to each place of worship. So that's Allah in the Quran reminding us in Surah Al-A'raf to beautify ourselves in salah in the masjid. And that's smell, it's clothes, value of the salah and focusing on the salah. And there's a lot of lessons to be derived from salah too, just like a few of them briefly mentioned. Is time management, for example, waking up on time, praying each thing on time, consistency, 5 times a day, every single day, that teaches us consistency, organization of movements, organization of thoughts, unity, we pray all together, it doesn't matter where you're from, and equality, it doesn't matter who you are, the wealth, the color of your skin. The front row is the person who got here earlier, and the back row is the people who got here later. It's not about rank or class or hierarchy. So it teaches us equality. It teaches us how to control our gaze, like just focusing on one spot, not getting distracted, not looking at haram things. It teaches us direction to face the qibla. That's a lesson in direction towards Allah and like redirecting your whole life. And also kind of reminds us of the sacrifice of the generations before us, from Sayyidina Ibrahim and Ismail, all the way to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the sacrifices of the Sahaba. All that's tied to the qibla, like the direction we're praying to the Kaaba. That has a history entangled with it too. So even just remembering that sacrifice can remind us of its weight. So it's important to just take the time. Prophet ﷺ used to recite in the salah, he'd recite each verse, ayah by ayah, and take a little pause, reflect on it, sometimes respond to it. And so that's like also a point we can maybe practice. And not every salah obviously has the same reward. Like a salah that has focus and khushu' in it, a salah that you take time, that's punctual, those things increase the reward for salah too. And so those are just some brief points about salah. And the last thing I'll mention is that some scholars have said that one of the beautiful things we can get out of the takbir at the very beginning when you say Allahu Akbar is that you kind of throw the whole world behind you. You say Allahu Akbar, God is greater than everything. You throw everything out of your mind and you just focus on salah. And so like the point of salah is to try to keep yourself focused on the prayer itself and not what's happening in your life outside of it. And then the next point is zakat, which very briefly is zakat comes from the same root as, say, the word tazkiyah. Tazkiyah is the act of trying to purify yourself, self-improvement, that process. So zakat itself means to purify your wealth. It's not just charity where you're just like giving. We know that giving wealth does not decrease wealth. Like giving in charity does not decrease your wealth at all. So zakat is a form of purifying our wealth from any haram or unethical issues or anything that might accidentally come through our work or through our lives. And this is a way of purification for us. And the next point is obviously Hajj. Hajj, the reflection there is like, do not delay unnecessarily. You make Hajj when you're able to in your life, and that's through health and wealth and all these other factors. But don't delay it. Try to always make sure it's in your dua, and try to strategically plan for it and make sure it's a priority in all of our lives, because it's one of the 5 fundamental pillars in our life. And it's like a beautiful thing, like there's this whole journey to Allah, and like this is a chance for you to actually travel to His house when He's calling for you. And so we should all try to strive to fulfill that call. And the last one is fasting. And fasting, the point of it, Allah tells us in the Quran, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you may learn and practice taqwa, which is like God consciousness, trying to fear God, understand God, love God, that whole concept of taqwa. And it's part of taming your carnal passions, which include food and like kind of lust. And in Al-Ghazali, he has like a whole chapter, a whole section, a whole book written on how to control the shahwatain, the two desires, which include food and lust. And if you're able to control those, it's like a path to spirituality, and it's a path to kind of like mastery over yourself. And that's kind of like a really brief run through. I mean, like a more proper run through of this would include fiqh and all these other issues, but obviously we don't have time. That's kind of like a brief understanding of all these things. And like we mentioned at the very beginning, these deeds are kind of the foundation, and if we are able to improve on these deeds, they'll open the doors to all these other good deeds that are also possible. So they're kind of like these rivers with streams that branch out of them. And so, there's a lot, I think like it's something that we need to reflect on. I think when you first read the hadith, it's very short, and it seems like, it's redundant, it came after hadith that just already mentioned everything, and it's like, it's just the 5 pillars. That's like the thing that we grow up with from like when we're kids. But there's a lot of value to each point and reflecting on it and trying to perfect it. Like, it's only these 5 things. Allah's not giving us a list of 100 things. It's just 5 things. Focus on these, make them good. And so, may Allah accept from us and make it easy for us to perfect them and get closer to Him and benefit from the words of the Quran and from His Prophet and from conducting ourselves in this way. May Allah accept from all of us and forgive us. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والحمد لله رب العالمين.